Hey there, kids. It's not your dad, but your LoreDad, here to talk to you about German October. As some of you may know, today is May Day, International Workers' Day. Today is celebrated by many socialists due to the coordinated strike on this day, leading to the 8-hour workday in several places in the world. To commemorate this occasion, I thought it would be a good day to post a pilot episode of Project German October. I hope you enjoy. In our history, the Bolsheviks were seeking to spread communism to as many nations in the world to trigger a global revolution. One of the places they had anticipated would be ripe for such a revolution was Germany. After the failed Spartacist Revolution in 1921, which was led by anti-Moscow communists, there was the infamous Hamburg Uprising. It's not hard to assume that this communist uprising had support from the Soviets. However, what may not be understood is that this is only one part of a greater plan, referred to by the Soviets as German October. The Soviets had supported several communist movements in regions like Thuringia, Saxony, and Hamburg. Their objective was to trigger their revolutions at the same time, and the Soviets would support them militarily. The hope of the Soviets was, if the Germans became communist, their industry would be used to allow for the Soviets to develop theirs. In some cases, the wording had implied that the industry itself would be taken. This plan of a coordinated effort between the three states was eventually cut off. Hamburg alone violently rebelled, as the other two states did not manage to revolt. Project German October seeks to establish a timeline where this plan is successful. But what sort of things can we do to ensure its success? The first, most obvious solution is to have Trotsky be sent to instigate the revolt. In our timeline, this was actually considered. However, the Stalin triumvirate was in charge, with the seriously ill Lenin no longer having a say in government. This triumvirate of Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Stalin were all anti-Trotsky, so they prevented his deployment, sending only low-ranking members of the Communist Party instead. So, is the solution to say simply, they decide to let him go anyway? I will have you know, we do not do that here. This decision would be out of character for all three members of the triumvirate. Therefore, for this to be possible, we need to have a further point of divergence. What better point of divergence could we have than the Soviets winning the Soviet-Polish War? In our timeline, the Soviets and Polish had a long, grueling war. At one point, Warsaw had been captured by the Soviet forces before the Miracle on the Vistula occurred, where the Polish encircled the Soviet forces, expelling them further east and leaving Poland with these borders. Now, many alternate histories that have the Soviets win in the Soviet-Polish War have Stalin actually following orders and aiding in the Warsaw attack. In our timeline, Stalin had disobeyed orders and attacked a different city than Warsaw. Now, this could be a great way for us to give the Soviets a greater advantage against the Germans. However, I would like to take a different approach. A very little known historical fact is that Trotsky, leader of the Soviet army at the time, and Hans von Seht, leader of the Weimar German army at the time, were in contact. These two had been discussing a potential German entry into the Soviet-Polish War. Trotsky had even told Seht that if he were to stage a border conflict against the Polish, he would see to it that the 1914 border of Germany and Russia be restored. In our timeline, this didn't happen. Seht did not take the meager German army under the restrictions of downsizing from the Treaty of Versailles and invade the Polish. It's hypothesized that this hadn't happened because of the Miracle on the Vistula. By the time that Seht could have coordinated this strike, the Soviet army was compromised, and the window of opportunity was lost. But what if Seht had staged a conflict anyway, and marched his meager army to conflict with the Polish? That is the question that Project German October seeks to answer. With the sudden introduction of the German army in the West, the Polish forces would not be able to push the advantage that the Miracle on the Vistula had afforded them. Instead, they would have to move their troops to fend off the German army. This allows for the Soviet forces to regroup, and eventually, the Polish capitulate. Trotsky followed his agreement with Seht, recognizing their claims on Danzig and Poznan, while the rest of Poland was conquered by the Bolsheviks. This is where things get complicated, as while the Soviets recognized Germany to control these regions again, the Weimar Republic could not. They were currently collaborating with the Entente in order to stabilize Germany and allow for them to follow the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles. Allied troops occupied the Rhine, Memel, and Lower Silesia. The latter regions were preparing for referendums to allow their local populations to determine their statehood. Now, the Polish of Silesia could no longer join the Polish Republic, as it did not exist. Weimar Germany would denounce Seat, attempting to distance themselves from the army in order to prevent further punishment from the Entente. The Entente would demand that the Weimar Republic take some sort of action against Seat for his independent action. However, what could be done? For better or worse, Germany was the new bulwark against Bolshevism. Punitive action would risk a communist revolution in Germany and potentially inspire their own nation's workers to revolt in solidarity. The only remaining recourse would be to attempt to alleviate the situation diplomatically. Following the League of Nations mandate system, they proposed that the lands that Germany had seized, and Lower Silesia, be turned into a League of Nations mandate administered by Germany, therefore inviting Germany into the League of Nations. This deal was amazing for Germany, as it allowed them to preserve their gains in a limited capacity, but also allow for recognition. Therefore, Weimar Germany would accept. However, Seat would refuse to comply. Seat would see the actions of the League of Nations as yet another attempt to impose their will onto Germany. And if Germany were to accept, they would cease to be a state. Therefore, he and his loyal Reichswehr would disobey the Weimar government. What comes in its stead is a German warlord period. The Weimar government would have an incredibly weak grip on their state, as the army has defied them, allowing for more to flock to Seat's banner. The NSDAP and Hitler would see their opportunity to revolt, and the beer hall putsch would succeed, adding yet another claimant to be the rightful leader of Germany. And, in the chaos, the communists seized power in Hamburg, Saxony, and Thuringia, just like the Soviets had initially hoped for. Thus, a civil war between the Weimar government, supported by the Entente and their stationed troops, Seat, supported by the army and Freikorps defectors, Hitler and the SA, and the communists, supported directly from Moscow. The Soviets had hoped to press their advantage against Germany immediately after the Polish had been defeated. But with the left SR uprisings and other issues in 1921, they were preoccupied. Now that those threats had been dealt with, the Red Army could support this communist revolution. Seat and his armies would be quickly subsumed as they're stabbed in the back by their would-be allies. Seat was a fool for expecting anything else. The French would quickly realize that Weimar Germany was no longer a functioning state, and instead prop up secessionist Rhinish and Swabian states as a means to set up buffer states between themselves and the Soviets. The Ruhr Uprising would allow for the communists to seize the eastern bank of the Rhine River, dividing the capitalist and communist worlds through it. The Nazis would soon be expelled from Bavaria after a democratic revolution dispels them. A policy of neutrality prevents their annexation by the Soviets, and the Nazis who participated in the putsch are either imprisoned or flee to Austria. As Trotsky begins to organize a second push to destroy the French client states and connect with the sympathetic communist uprising in France, news of Lenin's death begins a power struggle for leadership. Seeking to preserve the revolution, Trotsky would sign a peace with France, abandoning the communists there to consolidate their grip on Soviet Germany. Due to Trotsky's political cunning allowing for him to seize Poland and all of northern Germany, Lenin's last testament would be much more favorable to him, and much less to Stalin, allowing for Trotsky to become the leader of the Union of Soviet Republics of Europe and Asia, a proposed name for the Soviet Union, which would now be much more fitting given their territorial extent. What would the advent of a Trotskyite USREA mean for the world? What will the West do now that communism has spread to Central Europe? How will the left wing of Germany react to the industrialization of the Russian benefactors at their expense? How will the internal border disputes of the Polish and North German SRs be resolved? All these questions and more would be answered in Project German October. Thanks so much for watching this pilot episode of Project German October. I hope you have enjoyed. This timeline has been in my head for quite some time, so it's nice to get the initial events laid out for you all to enjoy and speculate on. There's a mod that I've worked on in the past called Red Vistula. It has a similar premise of the Soviets winning the Soviet-Polish War. I had introduced them to the idea of a mandatory Poland being made from the Seat invasion, and they incorporated that into their mod. So, if you're interested in seeing a timeline where Seat complied with the League of Nations vision, I recommend checking them out. The last remaining developer could use some help. Thanks to Serov for giving me feedback and ideas for this scenario. His suggestions haven't made into what I've revealed so far, but I wanted to thank him nonetheless.
Shout out to Balin Ora University and Enzo Rafael Souza Silva for being channel members. Thank you so much for your support.
If you want to have your name shouted out at the end of my video, please consider supporting the channel by getting a membership. Please let me know if you have any feedback or suggestions for the scenario. Happy May Day, be sure to check that you're being paid enough, and I hope you have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Please subscribe. Have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye.